Good day, my beautiful and wonderful children. Hope you guys enjoyed your Easter. I'm sure if you're like me, it was a bit odd and strange, but that doesn't necessarily mean bad, right? Odd and strange are okay, uh, I guess, usually. Um, I don't know about you guys. I ate my entire body weight in ham, and I'm I'm having what doctors would call, I guess, a bit of a weight problem. Not so much here, but definitely in this area, in my mid region. I feel like I'm gaining quite a bit of weight, and the longer that this quarantine goes, the worse this is going to get. But what are you going to do? What are you going to do? So yes, I ate my body weight in ham yesterday, basically. Okay, so today is a continuation of where we left off last week, which is this quiz show, Craze and Scandal. And I wanted to tell you one story in particular, just kind of illustrate how all this went down. So, just to recap, there were 22 of these types of shows in 1957 alone. Basically, if you think of today's TV, you know how like every other show is a reality show? That's basically how it was in the 50s. Every other show was a quiz show. So, eventually, what's going to happen is it's going to be brought to light that almost every one of these shows is rigged. And I want to tell you the story of the show 21 today, which is a really interesting case study in how this all went down. So, 21 was a very popular show on NBC, and it was a big money quiz show where contestants they'd have two contestants on at a time, and they would be put into soundproof booths, and then they would answer questions and try to be the first to get to the score of 21, and each point was worth a certain amount of dollars, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to talk about two contestants today that are at the center of this scandal. The first one is a guy named Herb Stempel. So Herb Stempel was from Queens, New York, and he was an ex-GI, former soldier, and he was going to community college. And at that time, in order to get on one of these quiz shows, you'd go down to the studio and you would take a test, and then they would decide whether you were smart enough to get on the show or whatever. And so he went down and he took the test, and he scored higher than anybody had ever scored on this test in the history of them doing this. So he gets on the show. So before he is even on one episode, the producer of the show is a guy named Dan Enright, goes to Herb Stempel's apartment in Queens, and he sits in his living room with him, and he says, "How'd you like to make $10,000?" And Stempel said, "Who wouldn't?" And from that second on, Herb Stempel was basically going to be, I guess you'd call him a paid actor to be on the show, but nobody knew that. Everybody thought he was just a contestant trying to win quiz show money. Um, so Enright, that night, he goes into Stempel's bedroom and he picks out. He says, "Here's the suit I want you to wear, and I want you to wear these type of glasses. Go down to this barber and have him cut your hair and look like this. Wear this type of wristwatch," and basically creates this character for this quiz show. Now, Herb Stempel, the person, was very, very intelligent, but also a giant turd. He was an awful human being and just annoying as all get out, and kind of like a robot, basically. Well, anyway, Stempel gets on the show, and at the beginning, people love him because he's a community college dude from Queens, New York, and people like to project when you watch TV. You like to look at that and go, "Hey, I could be that guy. I could win that money. I could do that." And so early on, he was very popular on the show. Well, the more he stayed on and the more he won, the more people hated him. And I'm going to attach a clip to this. You'll get to see him on the show, and you'll get to see him in recent times, and you'll see what I'm talking about. He was just a turd. But anyway, he's on and he's winning tons of money. Now, in reality, he wasn't winning anything. He was being paid a flat rate by NBC to be on the show, but nobody knew that. So he's on the show for quite some time, and at the time he had won more money than anybody in the history of television up to that point. And the makers of the show realize they got to get rid of him. People don't like him. He's not testing well with audiences. So another producer for the show is at a dinner party, a cocktail party in New York City, in Manhattan, and he meets this guy, Charles Van Doren. Charles Van Doren was a professor at Columbia University, which is an Ivy League school. He's from a very famous family. The Van Dorens were synonymous with intelligence in the United States. Pretty much everybody in the U.S. knew that family name because they were smart. His dad was a professor at Columbia. His mom was a famous author. His uncle was an author. Everybody knew those guys. Kind of like the anti-Kardashians of today, basically. Anyway, so they get to talking, the producer and Van Doren, and making small talk. Van Doren asks him, what do you do? And he goes, well, I produce this show. And Van Doren says, I think it'd be kind of fun to be on that. And the guy says, listen, do me a huge favor. Come on the show. You'd be great. And we'll pay you, I forget how much, but, thousands of dollars. And all we need you to do is beat Herb Stempel. Now, if Charles Van Doren had any kind of moral dilemma about any of this, it would have been right there at that dinner party in that conversation. But basically, he thinks about it for about 2 seconds and he says, sure, why not? It's a lot of money. It'll be fun. What the heck? So he gets on the show. Now, nobody knows that this is rigged, but both Van Doren and Stempel are in on it. And they play to a series of 2 different ties. And then on the third show, Stempel loses on purpose. And the question he ends up losing on, the question he loses on in the second game to make it go to a third game is a super simple question. It was, what movie won the Academy Award for the previous year? And it was this movie called Marty. And Marty is basically a movie about Herb Stempel. It's about a normal everyday guy, pretty plain, and it's about his life. It happened to be Stempel's favorite movie. He saw it a ton of times, and they made him miss that question, and that right there stuck in his brain, and he was livid and furious with the producers that they made him lose on such a simple question, especially when it was his favorite movie. Keep that in the back of your head. Well, anyway, they go to the third game, and Van Doren beats him, and Stempel loses. And then Van Doren goes on, and he's on the show now for weeks and weeks and weeks. He ends up winning the most amount of money ever. And meanwhile, Herb Stempel sees Van Doren's face on the cover of TV Guide and on the cover of Time magazine, and he gets angrier and angrier and angrier because he knows what nobody else does, which is this is all fake. So eventually what happens is Stempel had been promised 3 things by Dan Enright, by the producer of the show. One of them was that he would help him. He would pay him a bunch of money every week to help him write the questions for 21. And then another one was that he would put him on a couple of panel shows, some other TV shows, and that he would put him on the Tonight Show. And he didn't do any of those things. So Stempel's getting angrier and angrier and angrier. And eventually he gets so mad that he goes to the district attorney in New York City, and he flips on everybody. He rolls over and blows the whistle on everybody. So they call in all the contestants from 21, including Charles Van Doren. They call in the producers. They call in big wigs from NBC and from the production company. And under oath, all of them lie. All of them say, no, this Herb Stempel's a lying sack of crap. This is all fake, real. There's nothing to see here. Well, there's a couple of other smoking guns with some other shows. For example, there's a show called Tic Tac Dough, which is exactly what it sounds like. People play tic tac toe for money when there's questions or whatever. And there was a contestant on there who was sitting in the makeup room, and the reigning champion was sitting in the chair next to them and got up to leave and left a notebook that had all of the questions for that day's show in it. And so that person took that piece of paper and used that to blow the whistle. So there were a number of smoking guns that end up kind of tearing the lid off of this. Eventually, like we said the other day, it goes in front of Congress. This is during the McCarthy era, and Congress ends up flipping out. Now, up to this point, no laws have been broken. There were no laws against rigging quiz shows because who the hell would rig a quiz show? Well, there are now. If you get caught in a show that's supposed to be real and any part of it is staged or fake, somebody's in trouble. Somebody's going to jail or somebody's going to get fined. The only law that was broken was that those people that had testified in front of the grand jury in New York City had all committed perjury. So they all got it taken in and booked and arraigned. Van Doren had his mugshot taken, but nobody ended up getting even formally charged or convicted of any of this stuff. The end result of this, at least for for 21 is it vanished. It went off the air. The producer of the show got fired. The host of the show, a guy named Jack Barry, got fired. They ended up producing shows in Canada for about 10 years. Eventually, they came back to the US and they started making other shows and became millionaires again. Stemple kind of disappeared, but to this day, anybody that asks him about it, he will complain and say how he was jobbed in 1956. Van Doren's the one that really suffers. He gets fired. He had once he lost on 21, and by the way, he lost. It was rigged too. He lost to a woman named Vivian Nearing. They played to a couple of ties, and then he took a dive and he lost on purpose to her. Well, after that, for like a year, he was on the Today Show. He had a guest spot on the Today Show where he was their academic correspondent. He got fired from that. He got fired from Columbia. It was this hugely embarrassing event in his life, and he just passed away a year or two ago. But he only spoke twice publicly about this. Once when he testified in front of Congress, and actually you could look that up and see his testimony. He tells the whole story, and then he did an interview for the New Yorker magazine where he told the whole story, and that's the only time he ever talked about it. Herb Stemple, if you called him today, he would talk to you about it. He wouldn't care. And I'm going to link a recent interview with him so you can hear him talk about it if you want to see what it's like to be a bitter, angry old man. So that's the story. That's the story of the quiz show scandals. Now, if you want to see a really, really good movie about this, there's a movie called Quiz Show. It came out in 1994, I think. And it's about the show 21 and Herb Stemple and Charles Van Doren. It's got a lot of people in it that you would recognize. It was nominated for Best Picture that year. It didn't win. That was a pretty good year for movies. That year, it was up against a couple of movies you might have heard of. One of them was Four Weddings and a Funeral, which is a comedy. It was okay. The other three you probably have heard of. Forrest Gump, Pulp Fiction, and Shawshank Redemption were all up for Best Picture that year. That was a ridiculously good year for movies. But anyway, if you ever want to watch 21, or I'm sorry, Quiz Show, that's a really great movie that tells a lot more in-depth story about what I just told you about. So that's the lesson for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Tomorrow we're going to come back and we're going to talk about modern TV programming and talk about what's on TV now. So hope you guys enjoyed your Easter, and I'll see you tomorrow. Peace and love.